You know what? I was unfair to giant fantasy swords in the past. Let's talk about it. Haven't talked about this topic in a while. The video I made about the Buster Sword is from 2013, I think. And my opinion has changed since then. At the time, I was a little overly eager to discredit them. And I poked fun at giant swords, saying they're impractical even in a fantasy setting, even assuming superhuman strength, because then they would also have to have super weight. Otherwise, the centripetal force would pull them off their feet while swinging, and etc., etc. And I got some things wrong. So I was reminded of this by a video I saw yesterday by Alan Pan, who went through the trouble of getting a harness, not quite an exosuit as such, but a harness for operating heavy cameras that takes some of the weight off and helps you out. And he was able to modify it to the point where he could actually hold a giant Buster Sword and hold it forward, not just awkwardly lift it up and hold it over the shoulder. So pretty interesting stuff. First off, a few words about big swords in history. This is obviously a synthetic practice version, but swords like this existed. That Zweihänder or two-handed sword. Sometimes they're called great sword, although there's a bit of confusion with the terminology, because there's also the great sword of war, which is really more of a long sword. But whatever you call them, usually they were just called two-handed sword. Big things like this. Even these things are not as heavy as people expect. Here's a list of some weights of historical two-handed swords. And I mean, yeah, they get pretty hefty compared to every other type of sword, obviously, with the sheer size, but it's still not crazy. And in general, I've talked about that a number of times, the swords that actually existed in history were never really all that heavy. A long sword is a fairly large sword, and it was typically used with two hands, although could be used with one hand as well. And also including the Kriegsmesser or war knife, basically same kind of overall dimensions, except wider blade, single-edged. And these were generally in the range of about 1.1 to 1.8 kilograms, sometimes 2 kilograms. By the way, sorry if I'm all over the place with units in this video. I generally think in metric, but when it comes to having a feel for certain weights, I'm more familiar with pounds because, well, generally in North America, all the plates are generally in pounds. Some have kilograms on them as well. But either way, so this here, these are two 25-pound plates, and this bar weighs another about 10 pounds. So this is 60 pounds. And this, if you just look at this as such, this is not hard to handle. When talking about overly heavy swords, for example, in a review of a sword reproduction, if I say this weighs, 2 kilograms or whatever for a single-handed sword, which is crazy by historical standards, and somebody comes along and, "Oh, you're just weak, I bench 500 pounds, bro." First off, random keyboard warriors are definitely not benching 500 pounds, but even if they do 200, 250, which is respectable, that does not translate to swinging a heavy sword around. It really doesn't, because the weight distribution and the leverage that's exerted on your hands is tremendous. Alan Pan also explained that in his video.
That means in this position, with the pivot point at the very end of the handle, the sword is generating 150 foot-pounds of torque.
So, whether you can handle a certain weight is one thing, but if I try to lift this, like so, I have a pretty wide grip here, and this is already rather difficult. So, this would be a little tricky. So as far as real life is concerned with just humans, you don't want something that's overly heavy. Even if you have a strong man who can handle one of these, handling is not the same as swinging. What you generally see is they hoist them up and they drop them. They just let gravity do its thing. If in a real historical sword fight somebody showed up with a super heavy sword and just awkwardly hoisted it up and dropped it down, the opponent would just give them an incredulous look, step back, and while the sword is on the ground, they're awkwardly trying to lift it up again. They would basically just casually move forward and cut them. That's why historically swords were pretty light. But that's just for regular old boring mundane humans. What if you had magical superpowers or some kind of exosuit that gives you mechanical advantage that increases your natural strength by a factor of, who knows, 10, 20, 100, things like that? That would change things quite a bit. So the mistake I made when talking about centripetal force, how it would jerk you around, if you swing a sword forward, there's going to be a certain pull. So the centripetal force will want to pull you forward. However, my mistake was basically in assuming that the superpower is only in the upper body and not in the lower body. Because you can counteract that. In fact, you have to do that anyway. If I was standing here, just upright, no actual fighting stance, and I was trying to throw a strong cut, I can already feel, even with this, I can feel that I'm being pulled slightly forward, that my heels are lifting up. Well, that's why you don't cut like this. You assume a wide stance, feet apart, knees bent. This not only gives you the stability you need, it also allows you to actually put some force into it. I don't want to power this with just the arms. I want to power it with the body. And interestingly, Cloud Strife actually has a very wide, deep stance, both in the original, although that's a little bit hard to tell because he's basically 60-70% legs, but you can tell it there, and you can also tell it in the remake. He does take quite a wide, deep stance, what you also see in some of the historical manuscripts. Basically, the wider and deeper your stance is, the more stable it is. It also limits mobility to an extent, but everything has ups and downs, pros and cons, of course. So if they have enhanced strength and are able to swing this with the upper body, the lower body is going to be stronger anyway. Your core, your legs, always going to be stronger than your arms and shoulders, etc. So somebody who is overall superhumanly strong can absolutely withstand that. We can easily assume that. Personally, I always think it looks weird when a small framed person is wielding a giant sword. I mean, Cloud looks fit and everything, don't get me wrong, but he just doesn't look like he'd be able to handle this. Barrett looks like he could handle it if he had two hands. Either way, he's Mako infused and enhanced, so it's magic. If you keep using the momentum, you can do this all day. It's a lot easier than stopping, lifting it up again, cutting, stopping, etc. This is really easy in comparison because you keep using that momentum. He does that. He does a lot of circular movements, unfortunately some spinning too, but he definitely preserves a lot of the momentum in most of his attacks, I think. As far as the sheer size of the sword is concerned, there are, again, pros and cons. One really good thing about it is if you have such a wide blade, you can really optimize the blade geometry for excellent cuts. Because at that point, like I talked about in the video about blade geometry, edge types, etc., if you have a very wide blade, you can taper it nice and evenly from the thick spine all the way to the edge, which gives it very little resistance as it passes through the target. So for one, you have all that mass helping you out, push through the target and generate force and momentum, but you can also make sure that the cross-section tapers evenly. And of course, once again, this is a matter of balancing cutting ability and durability. If you make the edge too thin, or the blade too thin behind the edge, I should say, it will just fail. It will just break or roll or etc. whatever. It will just take too much damage. But if you If you make it thick enough, this kind of force involved would do a lot. It would not have to be shaving sharp by any means. It would still do a lot of damage. So that's good. And also, of course, the added mass means it can withstand all that force you put into it, with the exception of the weak point. I'm a little concerned about the handle, because even if a superpowered but regular sized humanoid character has the strength to swing this, there's going to be a limit to how large the handle can be. Because you need to be able to actually wrap your fingers around the handle. You know, if your fingers are spread too far apart, then you don't have as strong of a grip. So the handle, of course, is going to be basically the same whether it's a regular sized historical Zweihander or if it's a huge Buster sword or other fantasy sword. So now you have all this mass, you have all this torque working on the handle, and these massive impacts, superpowered impacts. And all that's supporting that is this skinny handle. That could be a problem. Now, again, in a fantasy setting, it could be a superior alloy, it could be something stronger than steel, it could be, once again, magically reinforced, etc. But if this was just regular steel, this would be prone to fail with repeated hard impacts. Another advantage is that with such a wide blade, you could basically use it as a shield to an extent. If he holds the Buster sword in front of him with the flat forward, that covers a lot of his body. So he could potentially even deflect projectiles with it. I forgot if he ever does. I don't think so, but I may just not remember. Either way, so that's good. But on the downside, it's a lot of bulk. It's a lot of sheer size to lug around. Even if you can, in terms of strength, it still limits what you can do. Even a historical two-handed sword, it limits the angles you have when cutting. So with a long sword, I can cut just about any angle, really. With this, there comes a point where it hits the ground. So I can't really, for example, this angle here, I can't do with this because it's going to hit the ground. So I need to use an angle more like this that allows me to actually follow through with this without hitting the ground. Sometimes you see fantasy characters just hit the ground deliberately, I suppose, or maybe it's supposed to show just how much a thing weighs and that even this character still struggles with it a bit. So this sheer size makes it more cumbersome to wield compared to a quote-unquote regular sized sword. But it would still be possible, and it would basically be a way of emphasizing offense and damage over maneuverability. I mean, not that Cloud is slow by any means. He actually moves pretty fast and nimbly, so that's clearly not his problem. But you know, he could be even faster with a smaller, lighter sword. But yeah, so on this one, I've definitely changed my opinion. I used to be too critical, and yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to discard it altogether. There's, you know, it is fantasy, it has magic, it's, you know, there are certain assumptions you have to make. Like, for example, with any kind of super strength needs to come super toughness. It wouldn't work otherwise. If you just had super strength, you would probably pull your own joints out of their sockets and tear your tendons, etc. Super toughness is just a requirement to go along with it. Otherwise, you'd just be breaking your own body apart trying to exert this much force. So yeah, I think that's about all I've got for right now. It's probably a relatively long video already, so we leave it at that. Hope you found it interesting or entertaining. Thanks for watching and have a good one, folks.